The last run, a mystery etched in time. The highway stretches endlessly under a moonless sky. The hum of an engine, fading into the night, like a whisper lost to the wind. It was November of 1979, when James Holloway, a 28-year-old truck driver, with a smile that could light up a rest stop at dawn, vanished without a trace. His rig, a weathered but reliable freightliner, was found abandoned at a desolate truck stop in northern Arizona. Keys still in the ignition, half a cup of cold coffee on the dash, and no sign of struggle. But James, he was gone, as if the desert itself had reached out and swallowed him whole, leaving behind only questions that would gnaw at his family for decades. For 40 years. The Holloways lived in the shadow of the unknown. His wife, Margaret, would wake in the dead of night, certain she heard the creak of the front door, the jingle of his keys, only to find silence. His children grew up staring at a photograph of a man they barely remembered, their father frozen in time, his laughter preserved only in the fading echoes of old home movies. Birthdays passed. Holidays came and went, and with each year the hope of answers dimmed, replaced by a quiet, gnawing dread. What if we never know? The police reports gathered dust. Witnesses, few as they were, offered nothing but contradictions. A stranger seen near the truck, a fleeting glimpse of a dark sedan speeding away, whispers of debts unpaid, or routes gone wrong, but no body, no ransom note, no final call, just an empty cab and a family left to piece together the fragments of a life that had simply stopped. Then, in 2019, a storage unit in Albuquerque, long forgotten and padlocked under layers of bureaucracy, was auctioned off. Inside, among yellowed receipts and rusted tools, lay a leather-bound logbook. Its pages were filled with James's meticulous handwriting, dates, destinations, fuel stops, all unremarkable until the final entries. The last 3 days before he disappeared, the ink was smudged in places, as if written in haste. The words, once ordinary, took on a sinister edge. "Something's not right out here," he'd scribbled in the margin of November 12th. 2 days later, the final entry read simply, "They're watching. Don't trust the toe." The rest was torn away, leaving only jagged edges where the page had been ripped. 40 years of silence. And now this, a voice from the grave, begging to be heard. What had James seen in those last days? Who was watching? And why had the logbook, the one thing that might hold the truth, been hidden away for so long? The answers lie buried in the past, waiting to be unearthed. But one thing is certain. The road doesn't just take you places. Sometimes, it takes you away forever. And for the Holloways, the journey to the truth has only just begun. Close your eyes for a moment. Imagine the weight of not knowing, the way it presses on your chest, steals your breath in the quiet hours of the night. Now ask yourself, how far would you go to bring the lost back into the light? Because some mysteries aren't meant to stay buried, and this one, its calling. The road was his canvas, and freedom his muse. He wasn't just a truck driver. He was a dreamer with the highway humming in his veins. The open road wasn't just a job to him. It was an escape, a promise of something vast and untamed. His name was whispered in truck stops from Ohio to Arizona, where fellow drivers remembered him as the kind of man who'd lean against his rig at dawn, coffee steaming in one hand, a half-finished letter to his wife in the other. He wrote about the way the desert sky bled into twilight, how the scent of rain on hot asphalt made him feel alive. Adventure wasn't just a word to him. It was the rhythm of his life, the reason he'd kiss his daughter's forehead before sunrise and tell her, "Daddy's chasing the horizon, but I'll always find my way back to you." His family still keeps the postcards he sent, faded edges, smudged stamps, each one a breadcrumb of his journey. His wife would trace the routes on a map with her fingertip, imagining him somewhere beyond the dotted lines, laughing with strangers over diner pie, spinning tales of the places he'd been. Their son, just 8 when he vanished, Saved every trucker's magazine he left behind, poring over the ads for big rigs, like they were treasure maps. "One day I'll drive just like Dad," he'd say, not knowing then how those words would ache with time. But beneath the wanderlust, there was a quiet longing, a man who loved the road but loved them more. He'd call collect from payphones, his voice crackling through the static like a lifeline. "Tell the kids I'll be home by the weekend," he'd promise, and for a while that was enough. His logbook wasn't just mileage and fuel stops. It was a diary of small hopeful things. A note about the best cherry pie in Nebraska, a sketch of a mountain pass at sunrise, and then the entries that didn't make sense. The ones that made his handwriting shake. 40 years later, the questions still hang in the air like dust in a sunbeam. What dreams did he carry in those final days? What made him pause mid-sentence, the pen hovering over the page, as if he'd heard something just beyond the cab's thin walls? The road gave him freedom, but it took him too. And now, as his logbook lies open once more, the ink faded but the words screaming, one truth cuts deeper than the rest. Some stories don't end. They just wait for someone brave enough to listen. Close your eyes. Can you hear it? The distant rumble of an engine fading into the night, and a family still waiting for the sound of his key in the door. The road had always been his confidant, a stretch of asphalt where the hum of the engine drowned out the noise of the world. But in the weeks leading up to October 1979, something shifted in the way he spoke about it. Friends at the diner where he stopped every Tuesday night noticed it first, how his usual stories of open highways and midnight radio tunes carried a new weight, as if the miles ahead were no longer just a journey, but a reckoning. He'd lean back in the booth, fingers tracing the rim of his coffee cup, and say things like, "You ever feel like the road's got a memory, like it's keeping score?" They laughed it off, chalking it up to fatigue. But his wife, Linda, heard the tremor beneath his words when he called home that final week. "Just one more run," he promised, though his voice cracked on the last syllable, as if the promise itself was a lie he couldn't bear to finish. Then came the last call. It was a Thursday, just past midnight, the static on the line thick enough to swallow half his words. Linda pressed the receiver so hard to her ear, she could hear the blood in her own veins. "The load's heavy tonight," he murmured. Not about the cargo, she was sure of it, but "I'll be back by Sunday. Keep the porch light on." She did every night for 40 years. What she didn't tell the police, what she only whispered to her sister in the dark of their kitchen years later, was the way he'd paused before hanging up, the way his breath hitched, like he was about to say something else, something urgent, then nothing, just the dial tone, humming like a ghost in the wire. His final stop was a truck stop outside Albuquerque, where the night clerk remembered him not for his face, but for his hands, shaking as he scribbled in that logbook, the one that would vanish with him. Guy looked like he'd seen something, the clerk told investigators decades later. But not out there. He pointed to the desert beyond the windows. "In here." He tapped his own temple. The last entry wasn't about mileage or fuel. It was a single line, underlined so hard the pen tore the paper. "They don't blink at the crossroads." No one knew what it meant. Not the state troopers who combed the highway for weeks. Not the private investigator Linda hired in '83, who came back hollow-eyed and refused to take her money. Not even the old mechanic who'd tuned his rig for years, who swore on his life that the man he knew would never leave his truck running with the keys in the ignition. Yet that's exactly how it was found, idling in the breakdown lane, like it was waiting for a driver who'd never return. And then there was the logbook, 40 years later, sealed in a rusted lockbox at the back of a storage unit. No one could explain how he'd paid for. The pages smelled of diesel, and something older, something like damp earth after rain. The entries in those final days weren't just notes. They were warnings. Met a man at the way station in Flagstaff. Said he'd been driving Route 66 since '52. Asked if I'd seen the lights. I lied. The CB's been picking up voices that aren't there. Or maybe they are, and that's worse. The handwriting grew erratic, the ink bleeding like the words were fighting to escape. The last entry wasn't dated. It was just two words, scrawled in what looked like haste or fear. Don't follow. Now the question lingers, heavier than the silence left behind. What did he see out there that made him break his own rules? What did he know in those final hours that turned his voice to gravel and his promises to dust? The road doesn't talk, but his logbook does. And if you listen close enough, you can still hear the echo of his warning, soft as static, sharp as a knife. Don't follow. So tell me, would you? The road stretched empty behind them, a black ribbon unspooling into the horizon, just as it had the night he vanished. But now, it was the silence that followed which haunted them. His family moved through the days like ghosts, their hands brushing against the edges of a truth that refused to be grasped. They searched, not with the frantic energy of those who expect answers, but with the slow, methodical despair of people learning to live in the shadow of the unknown. His wife would stand at the kitchen window long after the children had gone to bed, her fingers tracing the condensation on the glass, as if it might reveal his face in the patterns. She called every truck stop between Oklahoma and New Mexico, her voice cracking as she described him. Tall, lean, a scar above his left eyebrow from a childhood fall. The dispatchers on the other end would pause, flipping through faded logs, their apologies hollow against the weight of her hope. One by one, the leads dissolved, like mist under the morning sun. The police reports gathered dust, their pages filled with dead ends and half-finished theories. A witness claimed to have seen a truck matching his rig near Albuquerque, but the description was vague, the memory unreliable. Another swore they'd heard him laughing in a diner in Amarillo, but when pressed, the story unraveled like a cheap thread. His brother took to the roads himself, retracing the route in a borrowed semi, his knuckles white on the wheel as he scanned every rest area, every abandoned lot. He'd pull over at the same stops, ask the same questions, his voice growing rawer with each repetition. The other drivers would shake their heads, their expressions a mix of pity and unease. Some offered stories of their own, tales of men who'd simply walked away, of highways that swallowed people whole, but none of them had seen him. The CB radio, once a lifeline of static and camaraderie, now hissed with only silence when he keyed the mic, calling out his brother's handle into the void. The children grew up in a house where his absence was a physical presence, a chair left empty at the dinner table, a coat still hanging by the door. His daughter would press her ear to the shell of an old conch he'd brought her from Galveston, convinced that if she listened hard enough, she'd hear his voice in the ocean's echo. His son took to sketching trucks in the margins of his notebooks, each one a little more distorted, a little more monstrous, as if the road itself had teeth. And then there were the dreams. His wife would wake gasping, certain she'd heard the rumble of his engine in the driveway, the creak of the front door. She'd rush downstairs, only to find the porch light burning alone in the dark, illuminating nothing. The neighbors began to whisper about how she'd leave the coffee pot on all night, about the way she'd stare at the horizon as if willing him to appear. But no one understood the particular kind of madness that comes from loving someone the world has forgotten. 40 years of searching, and all they had to show for it were boxes of yellowed missing person flyers, a map pinned with red threads that led nowhere, and the slow, creeping realization that some questions are not meant to be answered. Yet they kept looking, because what else was there to do when the alternative was accepting that he had simply ceased to be? And so the road remained, and so did they, waiting, watching, listening to the silence for a whisper of his voice. But the night held its secrets close, and the truth, if it was out there at all, was still driving. The year the past, whispered back 40 years, had turned the edges of memory soft, the way rain blurs the ink on an old letter. The world had moved on, highways widened, trucks upgraded, faces aged, But for the family of Daniel Mercer, time had never quite healed the wound of his disappearance. Then, in the quiet hum of a spring afternoon in 2019, fate reached into the shadows and pulled something back into the light. It began in Unit 127 of a half-forgotten storage facility on the outskirts of Albuquerque, where the air hung thick with dust and the scent of decaying cardboard. The unit had belonged to a retired dispatcher, a man who'd worked the same routes as Daniel back in '79, a man who'd carried his own ghosts until cancer took him the winter prior. His daughter, clearing out the last of his things, had already donated the furniture, tossed the rusted tools, until her fingers brushed against something unexpected. A leather-bound logbook, its spine cracked with age, its pages yellowed but intact, and there, stamped in faded ink on the front cover, Daniel Mercer, Route 42, May 1979. Her breath caught. She'd heard the stories. How could she not? The way her father's voice would drop when he mentioned that name, the way he'd shake his head and mutter about roads that swallowed men whole. But this was no ghost story. This was proof, tangled in the threads of time, waiting. The logbook was heavy in her hands, not just with weight, but with something darker, an unspoken urgency. The first pages were routine, mile markers, fuel stops, the mundane rhythm of a long-haul life. But then the entries changed. The handwriting grew jagged, the notes less about schedules, and more about something else, something that made her skin prickle. She didn't read further. Not yet. Some doors, once opened, can't be closed. Instead, she made a call, and just like that, the past wasn't past anymore. Now imagine holding that book yourself, the dust of decades clinging to your fingers, the weight of a man's final words pressing against your palms. What would you do? Turn the page and step into the darkness with him? Or would you, like so many before, look away? Because some mysteries aren't just unsolved. Some are waiting, and Daniel Mercer's logbook has been waiting a very long time. The logbook lay open now, its yellowed pages brittle with time, each entry a whisper from the past, words scrawled in haste, ink smudged by fingers that trembled just slightly. The first of the final entries was dated October 12, 1979, and the handwriting had changed. Where once the driver's notes had been methodical, almost mechanical, now they coiled across the page like vines of unease. Route 37 again. Third time this month. Something's off about the way station near Elk Grove. The night guy never blinks, just stares, like he's waiting for me to say something, or like he already knows. The tension thickened with each line. By October 14th, the entries grew shorter, the pressure of the pen digging deeper into the paper. Chuck's been acting up since Missouri. Not the engine, something else. Like it's resisting. Every time I pass that diner with the flickering vacancy sign, the radio cuts out. Static. Then nothing. Then it comes back. But it's not the station I left it on. It's voices. Low. Talking over each other. Can't make out the words. But they sound angry. A sketch accompanied the text. A crude, jagged line that might have been a road, or a crack in something unseen. Then came October 16th, the last entry before silence. The ink here was frantic, the letters slanting as if written in motion. They're following me. Not cops. Not other trucks. Something in the mirrors. Headlights where there shouldn't be any. I pulled over near the old bridge. No one there, but the air smelled like burnt wiring and wet earth. And the logs in the back shifted when I wasn't moving. I checked. Nothing secured right. But it wasn't the logs. It was under them. Something heavy. Something that shouldn't be there. The page ended mid-sentence, the final word trailing off into a dark, jagged stain. Coffee. Or something else. The logbook didn't just document a route. It mapped the unraveling of a mind, pressed against the edges of an unseen terror. Each entry pulled back another layer, revealing not just a man's growing paranoia, but the slow, creeping realization that he was no longer alone in his cab. And as the pages turned, one question coiled tighter in the air. What had he carried with him that night? And what had carried him away? The answers, if they existed, were buried in the spaces between his words, waiting for someone to listen closely enough to hear the echo of his fear. The logbook's yellowed pages whispered secrets long buried beneath the weight of time. Each entry, a fragile thread pulling back the curtain on a mind unraveling under the strain of unseen shadows. He had always been a man of routine, meticulous with his logs, precise with his hours, but in those final days, his words betrayed a fracture beneath the surface. The handwriting, once steady and sure, now trembled at the edges, as if the pen itself hesitated to commit his thoughts to paper. There was something lurking in the margins of his notes, something darker than fatigue or loneliness could explain. The entries began innocuously enough: weather reports, mile markers, the usual litany of a trucker's life. But then, like a slow creeping fog, the tone shifted. Saw a pair of headlights behind me for hours tonight. Too close, too steady. No one passes, no one falls back. The words carried the weight of paranoia, the kind that gnaws at the edges of reason. Was it exhaustion playing tricks on his mind, or had something or someone begun to follow him? The uncertainty coiled tighter with each passing mile. The radio's been cutting in and out since Kansas. Static isn't just noise anymore. It sounds like voices. His descriptions grew more fragmented, his observations laced with a dread that seemed to seep into the ink itself. Yet it wasn't just fear that haunted those pages. There was a profound, aching loneliness, the kind that settles into the bones after too many nights on the road. Sometimes I talk to the dashboard, just to hear a voice that isn't mine. The admission was raw, unfiltered. A man starved for connection, in a world that had reduced him to a ghost between destinations. His reflections on home were the most heartbreaking of all. Dreamed of the kids last night. They were younger, like they were when I left, but when I reached for them, they dissolved like mist. The entries became a mirror, reflecting not just his surroundings, but the slow erosion of his grip on reality. And then, the final entry, just 2 lines, scrawled in haste, as if time itself were running out. They know where I stop. I won't make it to Denver. The words hung there, a chilling premonition, or a confession. Was it the delirium of a man pushed to the brink, or a cry for help lost in the vastness of the highway? The logbook didn't say, but the desperation in those last words clung to the page like a fingerprint. Impossible to ignore. Now, decades later, the questions linger. Heavier than ever. What demons had he carried in the cab of that truck? What silent battles had he fought in the dead of night, with only the hum of the engine for company? The answers may still be out there, hidden in the stretches of road he never returned from. But one thing is certain: his voice, preserved in those fragile pages, refuses to be silenced. It asks us to listen, not just to the words, but to the echoes of a man who in his final moments was more afraid of being forgotten than of whatever chased him into the dark. The logbook lay open on the worn kitchen table, its yellowed pages crackling under the weight of 40 years of silence. The family gathered around it, not as they once had, in laughter over holiday meals, but in a hush so thick it pressed against their ribs. Each entry, scribbled in his familiar hand, was a ghostly whisper from the past, pulling them deeper into a mystery that had haunted them for decades. They had waited so long for answers, and now, as the ink bled into the paper, like old wounds, they realized the truth might be more terrifying than the unknown. His sister traced a finger over the final entry, her breath shallow. Wrote 17, something's off. Can't shake the feeling I'm being followed. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of a premonition. His brother clenched his jaw, the lines of his face hardening as he fought back the familiar surge of grief. They had buried their hope long ago, yet here it was, clawing its way back to the surface. The logbook wasn't just a record of miles driven. It was a trail of breadcrumbs, leading them into the dark heart of a story that had never truly ended. The decision came without words. They would follow the route. Not as mourners this time, but as investigators, armed with nothing but determination and the fragile threads of his final days. His daughter, now older than he had been when he vanished, pressed the logbook to her chest. "We owe him this," she whispered. And in that moment, the family was bound by more than blood. They were bound by a promise, but fear lurked beneath their resolve. What if the answers they sought were worse than the silence? What if the road held more than just memories? The logbook had resurfaced for a reason, and as they prepared to retrace his steps, the air hummed with an unspoken question. Was he trying to tell them something? The journey ahead wasn't just about finding closure. It was about confronting the shadows that had lingered for far too long. And so, with trembling hands and steadfast hearts, they stepped forward into the past, into the unknown, into the story he had left behind. The road awaited, and with it, the truth. The highway stretched before them like a faded scar across the land, its asphalt cracked by decades of neglect and whispered secrets. They had traced his last known route, now mile by mile, following the brittle pages of the logbook as if it were a map to the underworld. The air hung thick with the scent of diesel and damp earth, the same smells that would have filled his cab on that final night in 1979. His sister Margaret clutched the worn leather binding tighter, her fingers tracing the jagged edges where time had gnawed at the paper. Each stop along the way was a ghost waiting to be confronted. The first entry led them to a roadside diner in Elk Grove, its neon sign flickering like a dying pulse. The booth where he'd scribbled his last meal order still stood in the corner, its vinyl seat split open, stuffing spilling like guts. The waitress, a woman now in her 70s, recognized the name when they asked. "Oh, I remember him," she said, her voice trembling. He was quiet, too quiet, kept looking over his shoulder like something was breathing down his neck. The family exchanged glances. The logbook had no mention of fear, only the cold notation: ate, paid, left. But the ink bled through the page, as if pressed too hard by a shaking hand. By dusk, they reached the abandoned way station outside Reading, where the next entry had been made. The concrete slab was still there, stained with oil and the rusted husks of old rigs. His brother, Thomas, knelt where the truck would have been parked, running his palm over the graffiti-carved walls. "He wrote about a noise here," Thomas murmured. Something like metal screaming. The wind howled through the skeletal remains of the station, carrying the sound of a distant semi-downshifting on the empty highway. Margaret's breath hitched. The logbook's margins held a sketch, a crude, frantic drawing of a shadow, stretched too long, too wrong against the cab's door. The final stop was the worst. A rest area, just beyond Shasta, where the last entry cut off mid-sentence. "Can't." The family stood in the gravel lot, the pines swaying as if whispering among themselves. His daughter, now older than he'd ever been, pressed her hand to the bark of a towering fir. "He would have seen this tree," she whispered. The air grew colder. A crow took flight from the branches, its wings beating like a slow, deliberate warning. The logbook's final pages were torn away, but the family didn't need to read them to know. The road had taken him, and now, standing in the gathering dark, they wondered if it was watching them too. What do you do when the answers you seek only deepen the silence? When every mile uncovered feels like a step closer to something that doesn't want to be found? The family would keep searching, because some truths, no matter how terrible, are better than the slow poison of not knowing. But as the headlights of their car cut through the blackness ahead, one question lingered, unspoken. What happens when the road starts following you back? The road whispers, and the locals know why. There is a stretch of highway where the pavement seems to swallow sound, where the trees lean in too close, their branches knitting together like skeletal fingers. This is Route 17, the last known path of Daniel Mercer, a young trucker who vanished in 1979, leaving behind only silence and a logbook that would not resurface for 4 decades. But long before his disappearance, the locals had names for this road: the Hollow Stretch, the Devil's Mile. And if you listen closely, they'll tell you why. The stories begin with the lights, flickering orbs that drift just beyond the reach of headlights, vanishing when pursued. Truckers who've driven this route for years swear they've seen figures standing motionless in the median, only to dissolve into the dark when approached. Some claim the radio cuts out at the same spot every time, replaced by a low, rhythmic humming, as if the road itself is breathing. And then there are the voices, not the kind that carry on the wind, but the kind that slither into the cab of a truck, whispering names no one has spoken in years. Daniel's family would learn of these tales only after his disappearance, each one a jagged piece of a puzzle they never asked to solve. But the most chilling legend is the one about the Phantom Rig, a semi-truck rusted and empty, said to appear in the dead of night, rolling silently alongside travelers before vanishing without a trace. Witnesses describe its headlights as dim, almost sickly, as if powered by something other than fuel. Some say it's a warning, others, a remnant of those who never made it home. Daniel's logbook, when it finally emerged, held an entry that sent a cold finger down his family's spine. Saw the rig again tonight. This time, it wasn't empty. The words were scrawled in a hand that trembled, the ink smudged as if written in haste. No one knows what or who he saw inside. The family clings to logic, to the hope that there's a rational explanation. Yet, as they stand on the shoulder of Route 17, the wind carrying the scent of damp earth and diesel, even they must wonder, what if the road doesn't just have stories? What if it keeps them? The answers, if they exist, are buried in the same silence that took Daniel 40 years ago. And the longer they search, the more the legends feel, less like warnings, and more like confessions. So, tell me, when you hear a story like this, do you dismiss it as superstition? Or do you listen a little closer, just in case the road is trying to tell you something too? The road had always whispered secrets, but now, as the family walked its dusty edges, it seemed to hum with something darker, something personal. They carried his photograph from diner to gas station, their voices trembling, just enough to betray the weight of 40 years, without answers. And the locals, they listened, some with narrowed eyes, others with hands frozen mid-stir over coffee cups, their own memories of 1979, surfacing like ghosts in the steam. At the Wagon Wheel Diner, where the scent of burnt coffee and fryer grease clung to the air, Marla, now silver-haired but still sharp, paused when they slid the photo across the counter. That boy? Her fingers traced the edges, stopping at the date scrawled in the corner. He came in 2 nights before he vanished. Quiet, ordered pie, paid in cash. But he kept looking over his shoulder, like the road itself was breathing down his neck. She leaned in, her voice dropping to a conspirator's hush. There were stories back then, about lights in the trees, about men who took that stretch and never came back. A pause, but folks called it trucker's exhaustion, until they didn't quote T. Then there was old man Harker at the filling station, his overall straps digging into sun-leathered skin. He didn't even glance at the photo. Another one chasing shadows, he muttered, spitting into the dirt. That road eats people. Always has. You think a logbook's gonna change that? His skepticism was a wall, but his wife, wiping her hands on her apron, stepped forward. Jim, she said softly. You remember the CB calls that week, the static, the voice that wasn't his. The air thickened. The family held their breath, and at the motel on the outskirts, where the neon sign buzzed like a dying insect, the night clerk, a gaunt man with ink-stained fingers, studied the logbook's pages as if they might bite. These entries, he tapped a line where the driver's handwriting had degenerated into frantic scrawls. They're watching from the overpass. The radio picks up voices when it's off. His voice cracked. I told the sheriff in 79. He laughed. But I heard him too. The family's reflection in his glasses wavered, their hope and dread twisting together. The community's responses were a patchwork of fear and defiance, each stitch pulling tighter around the mystery. Some dismissed them as grieving souls, clinging to folklore. Others, though, reached out, hands shaking, not with answers, but with fragments. A waitress, who swore she saw his rig idling at 3 a.m., driver's side door ajar. A mechanic, who found a single glove, still warm, near the guardrail the morning after. The road had taken their men, their brothers, their sons, and now it was giving something back. But was it truth, or just another layer of the myth, wrapping around them like the fog that rolled in at dusk? The family stood at the crossroads of memory and madness, the logbook heavy in their hands. Because the most terrifying question wasn't whether he'd vanished into the night, but whether the night had been waiting for him all along. And as the wind carried the scent of diesel and damp earth, one truth became undeniable. The past wasn't dead. It was breathing, waiting for them to listen. The road had grown colder with each passing mile, the weight of 40 years pressing down, like the thick fog that clung to the highway at dawn. They had knocked on doors, traced faded memories, and listened to voices cracked with time, some dismissive, others haunted by the same ghost that refused to let them rest. But none of it had led them here. Not until she spoke. Her name was Marlene Carter, and she ran the last functioning diner on Route 17, the kind of place where the coffee never stopped flowing, and the vinyl seats bore the scars of decades. Her hands, rough from years of scrubbing plates, trembled slightly as she slid the chipped mug toward them. The family had heard the same story a dozen times. No, I don't remember him. But Marlene's eyes flickered with something different. Not pity, not indifference, recognition. She hadn't worked there in '79, but her uncle had, and he'd kept something he'd never told a soul about until the cancer ate away his voice, leaving only fragmented whispers for her to piece together on his deathbed. A trucker came in late that night, she said, her voice dropping to a hush that made the air between them thicken. Not just any trucker, one who looked like he'd seen the devil himself. Ordered black coffee, paid in cash, left in a hurry, but not before scribbling something on a napkin, then shoving it into the logbook like it was the last thing he'd ever do. The family froze. The logbook, the one they'd spent years searching for, the one that had vanished along with him, had surfaced in a storage unit just 20 miles from here. And now, this. A napkin. A message. Marlene reached beneath the counter, pulling out a yellowed envelope. Inside, the brittle edges of a diner napkin, the ink faded but still legible. If you find this, don't trust the way station. They're not who they say. The words hit like a punch to the gut. His last stop had been the way station on County Line Road, a place the police had dismissed as irrelevant decades ago. But why would he warn someone about it? And who was they? The family's breath came faster now, their fingers tightening around the napkin as if it might dissolve into dust. 40 years of silence, and suddenly, the past was screaming at them. Marlene quote, send voice cut through the tension, low and urgent. My uncle said he wasn't alone that night. Saw a black sedan pull up right after the trucker left. 2 men got out, went straight to his rig. She leaned in, her voice barely above a whisper. They weren't cops. The diner's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, the sound suddenly deafening. This wasn't just a lead. It was a door, one that had been locked for 4 decades, and now, with a single key, they could finally step through. But what waited on the other side? The answer hung in the air, heavy and suffocating, as the family stared at the napkin, their hearts pounding in unison. What do you do when the truth you've chased your whole life is suddenly within reach? But the closer you get, the darker it becomes. The lead was a spark in the dark, fragile, flickering, but impossible to ignore. And so, the family began to dig. They traced the driver's last known route with the precision of cartographers, their fingers trembling over faded highway maps, the ink of his final logbook entries still hauntingly fresh. The handwriting, once familiar, now felt like a cipher, each loop and slant a clue, each smudged digit a whisper from the past. His sister, the most methodical of them all, cross-referenced dates with old weather reports, searching for patterns in the storms that had rolled through that autumn. His brother, a man who had long buried his grief beneath routine, now spent nights hunched over microfilm in the local library, squinting at grainy newspaper clippings about truck stop robberies and unsolved disappearances along the same stretch of highway. Their mother, her hands gnarled with age, traced the edges of the logbook's pages, as if she could summon him back through sheer will, her breath shallow, with the weight of 40 years of unanswered questions. But the deeper they dug, the more the cracks began to show. The family, once bound by quiet sorrow, now found themselves unraveling. Arguments erupted over trivial details, a misremembered date, a disputed gas station receipt, each disagreement a raw nerve exposed. The sister's husband watched in silence as she filled their home with spreadsheets and red string, her obsession carving a chasm between them. The brother's co-workers whispered about his hollowed eyes, the way he jumped at the ring of a phone, always hoping, always bracing. And their mother, she stopped sleeping through the night, convinced that if she closed her eyes, she'd miss the call, the knock, the miracle. Then came the storage unit, a lock rusted shut, a name half obscured by time, maybe his, maybe not. The air inside was thick, with the scent of mildew and old diesel. And there, beneath a tarp, stained with decades of dust, they found it a duffel bag, not his, but close enough to make their pulses race. Inside, a ledger with names, dates, payments and cash, some entries circled in red, some crossed out entirely, and tucked into the back pocket, a Polaroid, blurred but unmistakably him, standing beside a truck that wasn't his own, his face half turned toward the camera, as if he'd heard something just out of frame. His expression wasn't fear, it wasn't relief, it was something worse, resignation. The family didn't speak on the drive home. The weight of the duffel bag between them was a living thing, pulsing with possibilities too terrible to voice. They had spent years begging for answers, but now, with the truth finally within reach, they weren't sure they could bear it. What do you do when the ghost you've chased for 40 years starts whispering back? And what happens when the whispers aren't meant for you? The air in the dimly lit diner was thick with the scent of stale coffee and fried grease, the kind of place where secrets lingered, like the smoke clinging to the yellowed ceiling tiles. It was here, in this forgotten corner of Route 17, that she found him, a man whose name no one seemed to remember, but whose face had been burned into the memories of those who'd heard his story. He sat hunched over a chipped mug, his fingers trembling as he traced the rim, as if afraid the past might spill out with every sip. The family had chased whispers for months, but this was different. This was a man who claimed to have seen him, the last person to lay eyes on their vanished driver before the world swallowed him whole. She slid into the booth across from him, the vinyl creaking under her weight like a warning. The man didn't look up at first. His voice, when it came, was a rasp, the kind that carried the weight of too many untold truths. "You shouldn't be here," he muttered, finally lifting his gaze. His eyes were bloodshot, darting toward the door, as if expecting someone or something to walk through it. "Some things are better left buried." The words hung between them heavy and suffocating. She leaned in, her pulse hammering in her throat. "But you saw him, you talked to him. That's not something you just forget." A bitter laugh escaped him, more of a wheeze than anything else. "Oh, I haven't forgotten. But memory's a funny thing, especially when it's the last thing you've got before the nightmares start." The logbook had led them here, to this man, to this moment. Its pages, yellowed with age, had spoken of erratic routes, of detours that didn't make sense until now. He wasn't just driving, the man confessed, his voice dropping to a whisper. He was running, said he'd seen something on the road, near Black Hollow, something that wasn't right. His hands shook as he reached for a crumpled pack of cigarettes. The motion so deliberate, it felt like a distraction. What wasn't right? She pressed, but he only shook his head, his jaw clenched tight. You don't want to know. Trust me. The silence that followed was worse than any answer. It was the kind of silence that made the hair on the back of her neck stand on end, the kind that whispered of things lurking just beyond the headlights reached outside. The wind howled against the diner's windows, rattling the glass like it was trying to get in, or like it was trying to warn them. The man's fingers tightened around his mug, knuckles white. They'll come for you too if you keep digging, he said suddenly, his voice raw with something like fear. Or was it guilt? Who's they? She demanded. But he was already sliding out of the booth, tossing a few bills onto the table. The kind of people who make sure no one asks questions. The door swung shut behind him with a finality that echoed through her bones. She sat there, the cold seeping into her skin. The man's words coiled around her like barbed wire. The logbook had been a map, but this was a trapdoor, and she'd just been shown the drop. The question wasn't just about what had happened to him anymore. It was about what they had done to ensure no one ever found out. And now she was standing at the edge of that abyss, staring into the dark, wondering if she had the stomach to jump, or if the truth would pull her under before she even hit the bottom. What would you do when the answers you seek are tangled in warnings, and the past is a shadow reaching for your ankle? Do you run? Or do you step closer, even if it means becoming part of the mystery yourself? The air in the dimly lit living room grew thick with the weight of 40 years' silence, until tonight. Spread across the worn coffee table, the logbook's yellowed pages whispered secrets long buried, each entry a breadcrumb leading deeper into the unknown. The family had gathered once more, their faces illuminated only by the flickering glow of an old desk lamp. As if afraid to confront the truth in full light, fingers trembled over the brittle paper, tracing the final words written by a man who had vanished without a trace. And then, there it was, an entry that didn't belong, a name, scribbled in haste, circled in frantic ink, Harlan Voss, the same name the stranger in the diner had whispered just days before, his voice laced with something darker than fear. The room seemed to tilt as the pieces slid into place. The logbook didn't just document miles driven or fuel stops. It was a confession, hidden in plain sight. The last entries weren't about routes or weather conditions. They were warnings. Met Voss at the rest stop. He knows about the shipment. Said they'd make me disappear if I talked. The words blurred as tears welled, but the meaning was unmistakable. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't a wrong turn into the night. It was a man who had seen too much, who had tried to leave a trail, one that had taken 4 decades to find. A cold dread coiled in their stomachs, but beneath it, something else pulsed. Urgency. The logbook wasn't just a relic. It was a map. And if Harlan Voss was still out there, still breathing, then the clock wasn't just ticking. It was screaming. The family exchanged glances, unspoken questions hanging between them. Do we go to the police now? Do we follow the trail ourselves? The risk was unbearable, but so was the thought of stopping now, when the truth was finally within reach. Yet, in that charged silence, another emotion surged. Hope. For the first time in 40 years, the unknown had a shape. The monster under the bed had a name. And if they were brave enough to face it, maybe, just maybe, they could drag the past into the light. But the night was deep, the road ahead darker, and the question lingered, how much are they willing to lose to find what was already taken? The answer would come soon, and it would change everything. 40 years of silence had settled over the family, like a thick, unshakable fog, until the logbook surfaced. And now, as they sat together in the dim glow of an old desk lamp, the pages spread before them like fragments of a ghost's confession. The weight of what they'd uncovered pressed down on them, not with the crushing force of finality, but with something far more haunting, almost knowing. The last entry, scrawled in hurried, trembling script, didn't answer the question of where he had gone, but it whispered why. And in that whisper, the family found something they hadn't dared hope for. Not closure, not yet, but the first fragile threads of understanding. The words in that logbook were not the frantic scribbles of a man in terror, but the measured, heavy notes of someone who had seen something he wasn't meant to see. A detour recorded in the margins, a timestamp that didn't align with his usual route, and then the phrase that would echo in their minds forever. If this is found, tell them, I didn't run. No cry for help, no desperate goodbye, just a quiet insistence that his disappearance was never his choice. For decades, they had carried the burden of doubt, the gnawing fear that he might have simply walked away. But those words, yellowed with age, yet sharp as the day they were written, severed that doubt like a blade. He had vanished, but he had not left them. The resolution didn't come in the form of a map coordinate or a name scrawled in the margins. It came in the way his daughter traced her fingers over the ink, in the way his brother finally exhaled a breath he'd been holding since 1979, in the way his widow allowed herself to weep, not for the man she lost, but for the years she'd spent questioning his love. The logbook didn't bring him back, but it brought back him, the man they'd remembered in fragments, now restored in the defiance of his final words. They would never know the full truth of what happened on that stretch of highway, but they knew this: he had fought, and in that knowledge, something inside them shifted from grief to grim determination. They would fight too, not for answers anymore, but for his legacy. The mystery endures, as such things often do, but the family no longer stands in its shadow. They have stepped into the light of what they do know, and it is enough to carry them forward. Perhaps that is the nature of true resolution, not an ending, but a redefinition of what it means to live with the unknown. The road stretches on, just as it did for him, and though his journey ended in silence, theirs continues in the echo of his voice, preserved in ink and memory.